Yes, there we go. Okay. So I'm sure that there are many, many questions for Darryl. And let's open the floor. So questions, comments on the back of Darryl's lecture? Disagreements? Corroboration? Not so much disagreement. Alex?
First things first, I thought it was like a really good presentation. I've studied history and I'm familiar with Chinese history, especially prior to the 15th century. I'm familiar with Western history, and I would more or less not find any disagreement, but only on like technical details. For instance, I mean, I've been doing a course at the LSE on international institutions. One of them is on the Bretton Woods system, 51 to 71. They conclude the same thing, that the Americans broke it by going to war. Another interesting thing about the Opium Wars, and by the way, my grandfather was also a historian, and he hated the British. He thought they were evil. I think they're evil too. It's great. And another bit about the Opium Wars that I found out when I was doing my own research, when I was an undergrad, in the British press during the 1840s, the British press would slam the Chinese for not being pro-free trade. And that's how they sort of justified it to the public going to war, because they wouldn't sell them their goods. So I mean, you're entirely correct, but I guess to point out a criticism. You said that real business cycles came into existence after 1600, so after a period when banking in England presumably becomes important. But does this have anything to do with Fisher's price revolutions? Because if there's price revolutions that start on, I think it's 1200 or so, then there's no sort of central banks, but there is a sort of something driving this sort of
dynamic
boom and bust kind of situation where you have an increase in prices and then they fall again, and they're periodic.
Sure.
That's a problematic.
That's a problematic question. Fisher deals with this in his book. And he said there have been many people who've come to the table about this issue, trying to explain it in their own way. The Kondratiev people on demographics, population growth, many different people, they've all brought their discipline to the table on this reoccurring, this stability, a wave of rising prices and a collapse of wave in prices. And he said, no one has the piece on it. He himself comes to no conclusion. He said, it's not my part to explain why this happens, only to note that it does. And he leaves it at that. He's got the data, he brings it in, and it's just research. But you're exactly right. There's something not spooky about cycles. There's something. I mean, Sandy he's from India, as much as he will speak on behalf of the Crown in this. All right? And this culture has a deep understanding of historical cycles, far beyond ours. I mean, the Mayan cycle is like a blip in the Yugas and the Indian cycles, all right? And there's really sort of no explanation, and it may not be true, or it may be true, but there's always this sense that we, as sentient beings, are part of something that is bigger than us. One of the things that I believe is that one of the things that Western consciousness has done of late is that our intellect, our ground of being is focused in who we think we are, all right? And that's just who we think we are. But we have such agreement on it that we don't question any other way. And it's these things like this, it's things like this, it's things like these things that come in and there's no explanation, all right? Or if there is an explanation, we have not yet found it. And that's what I'm going to say. I'm sure there is an explanation. We just haven't found it. And, at a certain point, you live with mystery. And Fisher notes this. He said, I have no idea why these things happen. Greater minds than me have stepped in and tried to explain the periodic, and they try to bring their discipline to the table to measure it and explain, why this thing happened, He says, You know, he says, that's not my point. I just want to point out that this happens like that.
Just as a side note, I just did a little bit of homework really quick. EH.net, Economic History Services, like .net. It's like one of my favorite websites, and they publish a journal. They're like the big boys. Of course, they have a review on the book. And there's a gentleman over here. I don't know his credentials. His name is John Monroe. He basically slams his book for being not being mathematically rigorous, and for being yeah, no, it's a pretty weak criticism. But I think it's justifiable, because the only thing is measuring this kind of stuff is the most controversial part. There's a lot of filling in the gap when you have missing observations, and historians usually do this. So I'm not an expert on it because I didn't manage to do long-run economic growth at the LSE, so I'm not an authoritative person, but I'm very interested, and I can actually find something like tangible the next time around. Another thing I was going to mention is that you talked about bankers and how bankers are evil in the sense that they just make money by lending out money.
I am guilty of a broad brush.
You already know where I'm going with
I understand.
This. It's a bank that is has a chartered monopoly.
Yeah.
Is different from a risk-taking institution that's subject to market forces.
To market forces.
Right, in a free market model.
Sure.
Right. But it's just something I want to mention.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna. Nobody raised their hands. So I'm just gonna keep on rambling.
Yeah.
You also mentioned the word capitalism, and how basically I personally have thrown out the word altogether because it's too loaded. But you're entirely correct that with the fall of communism, capitalism, this very vague term, has somehow come into prominence, and it's been used to justify a new economic order that somehow revolves around the US. For instance, one of the things that I studied was the role of the World Bank and the IMF and growth in like the later 20th century. One of the things that I noticed is that actually I think the World Bank is an agent of Wall Street, because they get told what to do by the Treasury. And there's one very controversial academic, his name is Robert Wade, who talks a lot about this kind of stuff. And the example of Stiglitz, and another economist, an Indian guy who ran the World Bank afterwards, who both pressured by the Treasury to basically further Wall Street interests. Because there's two kinds of versions of capitalism. There's the free markets, global capital circulating as fast and quick, and we get the most efficient outcome. And we need to elevate the status of the poorest people in society and bring them up to speed, basically, so it can guarantee a better standard of living for everyone. And Wall Street are in favor of the former policy, because it's in their own interest.
I want to add something here, because you brought it about Bretton Woods and the World Bank. There was Bernard Baruch was there at Bretton Woods. And when they put that system together, Bernard Baruch turned to somebody and said, "This is wonderful. If we get this in place, we will be able to buy up the world's commodities on the cheap." That's how he saw it. He saw it as a mechanism whereby they could do that. And you're right in the sense that they've been at the hand of the U.S. all along. That agenda was there in the beginning. All right? Maynard Keynes tried to come in with their Bancor, and I got to say, the British are a lot fairer. They're not always fair. When push comes to shove, none of us are. All right? But they do have this thing about fair. You shouldn't scream during tennis matches when the guy's serving. It's wrong. All right? It's a game of skill. All right? And the British, I don't know if Keynes' thing was fairer than the IMF World Bank version put forth by the US, but I know it was probably fairer.
Rudy had a question or comment?
No.
No? Okay.
I'm speechless.
You're speechless? Okay.
If you want to comment, I think Darrow's three legs are yeah, you can see that. And it's sort of a parallel to the three legs of the gold standard, the stable three-legged stool with your gold, bonds, and bills, and the three legs, the psychological aspect where you can't separate money from people. So yeah, if you can grow it, if you can keep it under control. I mean, some guy said, I think it was Alan Greenspan, that all we have to do is handle paper as if it was gold. as if being where it falls apart. It's not.
Rudy,
Yes.
I would like to add a caveat to what you just said. Many bankers believe it is quite possible to separate money from people.
From the other people and bring it to these people.
Any more questions? Comments? Alex?
I was wondering, how did you get all this information? The only paper that I know about money on China is the Gordon Tullock paper published in 1956.
There's this incredible piece of paper, of work. And, there's a tremendous amount of information out there, and I was just lucky to run across the professor very early. I tell this story about you. And I was trying to read as much as I could about gold. And I ran across your name, and I let it go. One, it was foreign. Two, the name of the article was, I didn't get a handle on it. And something made me come back. And I hit that link, and I read it, and I went, my God, this guy understands money. All right? And I think that's sort of the guidance of where this information comes. But to answer your question, there's a book, and it's not even, you can only buy it from Ralph, basically. It's called Fiat Money, The History of Our Currency. All right? And his name is Ralph T. Foster. He's a coin dealer from Berkeley. And what he did was this, quite ingenious. For those of you who have gone to school, and you'll know this too, that graduate students are sort of the cows that professors can milk in their research, all right? And they're all over Berkeley. I mean, they're littered. They're all over Berkeley, all right? And this is where Ralph was a coin dealer, all right? And he decided, this was genius, he decided to hire graduate students to research fiat money, all right?
When was this?
This was back in the 70s and the 80s and like that. So he said, for really a modest sum of money, because universities don't pay graduate students very much, all right? And a few meals here and there, he was able to pick their brains. He said they would get books from Sweden. I mean, these are, and they talk about all this kind of stuff. So he basically collated all these grad students writing this stuff. They went to they put as much work into his project as they did on their theses. All right? Now, why I got the book was this. I was reading John Williams' Shadow Stats. And in his paper, he recommended one book. Ralph had already gotten a hold of me. And he said, you should read my book. A lot of people try and get me to read what they want me to read. All right? And you can't filter. You got to filter. But when I saw that John Williams recommended it, I went out and got that book. And it's stunning. It really is. That's where I got the history. And that's why I knew I could bring it into this crowd, because I know this crowd is formidable in terms of their knowledge base. I figured that if things got real tough in the question and answer period, I could defer to Sandeep, to answer any questions, and because he does it so well. But he was my backup plan.
No, excellent. Thanks. I'll look it up for sure.
Any more questions or comments? I've got a question though.
Are you speaking for the king or yourself?
For myself. What do you think is going to happen to the standard of living in the West from here on?
It's going. Martha and I have a map on our wall. All right. And we got it from it's a French think tank, and I'm sure a lot of you could get, it's one of those, I can't even pronounce the name, but they made a map of the world, all right? And the map was based upon who are the countries that are going to be most affected by the collapse, all right? And then they color-coded it, all right? Now, the ones that were least affected were countries like Mali, all right, sub-Saharan Africa, all right, because they're already living at a certain level, and they're gonna, the collapse is not gonna take them down much further. they live a simpler life that's not so much based on technology, all right? And the countries that were going to get hit the worst were the countries that we're from, all right? The countries that have, but you see, I think we have a role here. And you have a role. And that's why we're here. Everybody has come here because of this man. All right? Everybody has come here because there's a voice of reason, of seeing something and saying there's something wrong. And the people in this room aren't attached to the old model. We have very different degrees of perhaps about what the old model was, about what's going to happen. All right? But it is going to be big. All right? It's going to be big. And this map is fascinating because they went through every country and they had a list of factors which determined how the shift was going to happen. Be that as it may, because that's a country-by-country basis, there was a paper by a person, are you familiar with Dmitry Orlov? It's a wonderful paper. Yeah. Wonderful man, okay? And Dmitry was an engineer, all right? And much of what we see is because of our point of view and our experience and our basis, all right? Dmitry was born in Russia, and he's an engineer, and he was there during the collapse after the 90s. Went down, all right? And he saw it, all right? And he lived through it, and then he moved to the United States, all right? So he's working here, he's got his job and doing like that, and he looked around the United States and goes, holy smokes, what happened in Russia is going to happen here. All right? And his view of what happened in Russia is very different than our view of what happened in Russia. Dmitry's view of what happened in Russia is they were just simply living beyond their means. The oil wealth had come in. Now, granted, they had a state-run economy that was highly inefficient rather than a market economy. It had lots of glitches in the system. But the truth of the matter is, that Russian oil had raised these people from really poverty into TVs, and they were doing better. They all felt better because it's all relative. There are people on the Upper East Side that when they fall, they're going to go to a level that we're not at, and they're going to be horrified. I mean, where's their nanny? What are they going to do? They're going to be horrified. We're going, God, if I can live like that, man, that'd be cool. All right? Well, Dmitry said the Russians, when all of a sudden Norway came online, it just took the legs out from under Russia, and they were sunk. All right? And they dropped like rocks. All right? And he said it was really cultural cataclysm on a level that we have never seen before. And he came to the United States and he said, this is going to happen here. And he gave a few recommendations. All right? He said, the first you're going to see is a problem with the financial institutions, which we've seen. All right? And the latest step in the financial institutions is the taking on of debt by the central banks. This is very recent. The ECB happened, they just took it on starting December and January. They're balanced. They fought to try and keep their balance sheet clean. They had to keep their system going, so they took on the bad debt of the system. The Fed did this since 2008. I can guarantee you that neither central bank wanted to have their balance sheet like it is now. They've been forced to do it. So he said, you're going to see the closures of financial systems. We're going to see it, but in a different way than it happened in the 1930s. Then he said, you're going to see the problem with commercial entities. You're going to see stores that you are familiar with close down. You're going to see supply lines get screwed up. You're going to see a disintegration of that. Then he said you're going to see social collapse. Standard of living is going to fall. All right? Now he said, where the danger comes in is cultural collapse. This is where he says it gets scary. All right? When cultural collapse happens. All right? Because this is something that we're not used to. It's an invisible fabric that we share, all right? And that is very, very destructive. And Dmitry said, listen, it's going to happen. He said, and his palliative was we're going to survive in groups. He said, we're going to survive as a whole, as a collective, all right? And it's a collective that we don't know. We don't know our neighbors. Money has allowed us to isolate ourselves from each other. It really has. It's that simpler the small town where everybody knew each other. There was a basis. You knew who was who and who you can go to help. As we got more independent, we needed less from each other. All right? The thing that I see happen is, one, we are going to experience a collapse. But I do not believe, I believe like that Fisher is, that it's going to come into something better. My model for this thing is really Buckminster Fuller. All right? And Bucky said in 1981 in his last book, Critical Path, he said, he entitled the foreword, The Collapse of the World's Power Structures. He didn't say the collapse of communism, the collapse of capitalism. He says the twilight of the world's power structures. All right? The twilight of the world's power structures. That's how he started the preface. And in the first paragraph, Bucky said, mankind, this is 1981, he died a year later, mankind is entering a period of unprecedented crises. This crisis is universally intended to transform humanity from its present differences-based, differently modeled, differently credoed, differently colored, separate entities into a cooperative, interdependent, interharmonious whole that will ultimately have a higher standard of living than the planet has at this time. Bucky said that their technologies exist at this moment that would allow us to have it, but that the powers that be are not going to let them out until their existence is so threatened that they don't have a vested interest in hanging on to it. He says this is the history of humanity. But this crisis is going to take the hair off the back of our necks. And it's not only going to take the hair off the back of our necks, it's going to join us again to each other. Now this may not be true. I come from a country that has more guns, more ammo, more people stocking stuff ready for this collapse to happen. But Bucky said, this is not what's going to happen. This is a crisis that is going to bring humanity together on a level that has never been before. Just like that period of Victorian equilibrium brought the world together. And it really did. We're sitting here at this table talking in English. All right? We come from different heritages, different countries, different experiences. You know, we have an internet where you can go, and there it is, unless you live in China. All right? And even there, it's going to give way. There's a momentum. We are a part of that momentum. I don't believe, one of my sayings is, life is a miracle. With a caveat, it's a hell of a miracle. After the hell comes the miracle.
I also would like to.
Okay, Professor.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go on, Professor.
My question concerns the Chinese communist government as it exists today. And in particular, the fact that they have been accumulating all this paper wealth in the form of US Treasury bonds. One day, I believe that this is a strike of genius, something visionary, something, and it fits into the Marxian worldview. And next day, I think it was the most stupid thing ever any government ever did.
Yeah.
And I still don't know.
China is a really curious thing. I majored in East Asian studies. All right. And China is really curious because there are all these consciousnesses, these bits and pieces of consciousnesses. And your point is really well taken because that is a huge overhang. And what happens with it, what's done with it, is going to be very, very critical. You asked me about my friend, the German, okay, who you know. And I'm not going to talk about him, but I'm going to talk about a friend of his, all right? He met this person in Boston in the 1970s, and he's Iranian, all right? And I watched their email exchange because they only recently came back together 2 or 3 years ago. His Iranian friend has lived in China since 1980. He speaks Mandarin, Cantonese, a few other dialects, and has achieved the level of a master calligrapher. All right? This is no small achievement for a foreigner. All right? And he sent me some of these interviews with him on TV in China. And he said something that stunned me. Because I watch it too. What's going to happen? And he said something that was very, very insightful. He said, based on our own perception of how the Chinese have been, we think it can go this way, we think it can go that way. He says, I think we're going to find out that China, like the rest of us, is in transition. They don't know how they're going to turn out. And what is going to come out the other end is going to be as much surprise to the Chinese as it is to us. I was in China in 1976, very early on. I was 31 years old. I was one of the few Westerners that got in there at that time. I was there when the Red Guard was still in power. They were falling at the time. And I watched it because it was my major in college. And I had my druthers on who I wanted to come out. All right? I wanted Zhou Enlai to come out. You had this power struggle between Zhou and Mao Zedong. All right? And Mao Zedong was that's who he was. And Zhou Enlai was rather the heart of the whole thing. All right? And we watched it, this tug of war. And both of them were dying. Okay? Hanging on to power. Who was going to live? Who was going to be the last one at the helm? And my God, Zhou Enlai died first. My usual rush to judgment, I gave up the goods. You know, I used to leave the TV when the 49ers were down by 20 with 3 minutes to go. And Joe Montana was the quarterback. And then I hear screams coming in front. My God, they won. All right? But I'd leave the room. China did the same thing. Zhou Enlai dies. I give it the ghost. There's Mao Zedong. He's got it. His wife is going to come in. The Red Guard's going to take it over. It's over. Mao Zedong appoints an unknown Hua Guofeng out of Hunan province who no one knew. And if you looked at him, he bore a remarkable resemblance to Mao Zedong. Same melon head, that same little dimple on his thing, you know. And no one knew him. And he was now the titular head of China with no power base. No power, except Mao Zedong. 3 months later, Mao Zedong dies. Boom! The army moves, takes out the Red Guard, takes out all the right-wing hardliners in the Communist Party, and Zhou Enlai ascends to power. Deng Xiaoping, who was one of Zhou Enlai's people, comes back and ushers China into capitalism, and the world changes. So, we can call it. We're going to be wrong. We're in a period of intense change, where the variables are so far beyond us. You know, we all have our druthers, but that's all they are. And China is going to be a big player. Very few people know what happened in China in the last 2 weeks. This is extraordinary. What?
I wanted to ask you exactly that.
It's extraordinary that happened. In the last 2 weeks. All right? China is an opaque country. You can't see. All right? I mean, secrets is what China runs on. They don't tell anybody what's going on because knowledge truly is power. All right? What happened is a mayor of a town called Chongqing, all of a sudden, before that happens, something really bizarre happens. Something happens. News comes across that the mayor of Chongqing, not a small city, because I don't think any cities in China are small, but it's nowhere as big as Shanghai, Beijing, or whatever. It's at the base of Tibet, on the other side of the hills from the Himalayas, all right? The police chief ran to the American embassy. Wow! What the hell did he go to the American embassy for? All right? And all of a sudden there's this, muffled stuff that's going on. And then he sort of leaves the embassy, the American embassy, and he sort of disappears. All right? That's the thing. Now, he was the police chief of Chongqing. The mayor of Chongqing, the next thing you know, goes to Beijing. This is big. What's convening is the National Party Congress. Not formally yet. All of the bigwigs are meeting. They're all meeting there, okay? The big deal is going to be in the fall, in October, all right? But they're all there. And the next thing that happens is